So far, this is like an amazing story, but we obviously know that this is just setting up, this was the ideal. This was, you know, the best it could have gone, but then something terrible happens on the 3rd page, Genesis 3. And for the first time we see that there are other forces and agendas that are at work that are anti what God has done, anti the life that he has created, and the reign and rule of God on the earth. And this adversary takes the form of the serpent in Genesis 3. And so he comes in, and what does he do? He begins speaking to them. And so sort of skipped over this, but so God's created this amazing world. It's fruitful, it's full of life. He's blessed them. They've been given the blessing. And they're gonna go and just, you know, rule over this planet with God, in partnership with God. But when it comes to, you know, whether you're cultivating the land or naming the animals or whatever, there's decisions that have to be made. There's probably right ways to cultivate the land and wrong ways to cultivate the land. There are the right names to give certain animals, and there's the wrong names, the wrong identity to give them that doesn't fit, right? These are just like really basic decisions. You're not even thinking about, you know, how are we gonna, you know, establish communities and families and all of those, and like what's the right way and wrong way with that? Like, we're not even touching that. There's a right way and a wrong way to do everything. There's a way that's functional, and there's a way that's dysfunctional. And God says to them right away, there's a way for you, humans, there's a way for you to seize the ability to define good and evil for yourselves, but I'm gonna ask you not to do that. In fact, if you do that, it's actually gonna introduce something I don't want in the world, which is death. And so hands off this one particular tree. Tree of life, go crazy. All the other fruit-bearing trees, go nuts. But this one tree, which represents the ability to decide for yourselves what's right and what's wrong, stay away from it. It's a killer. So how are they gonna know what's right then if they're not allowed to do that? The only source, the only person so far in this story who seems to really know what is good and what's not good, because he's been calling it out from the very beginning, is God. And so God's intention with the humans from the beginning is, we're gonna do this together. I'm gonna be in partnership with you, and my wisdom, my discernment between good and evil is what's gonna guide you as we reign and rule over this wonderful world together. You're gonna position yourselves under my authority and submit yourselves to my wisdom as you fill and spread and are fruitful and multiply and filling and all this wonderful stuff. Like that's God's intention. And so the serpent comes into the story, and he immediately begins attacking what God has said. He actually attacks God in his motives. He approaches the humans with the lie that, you know, God is holding you back. God's making you dependent on him, but you could be independent. You could make it so that you don't need him, and he's afraid of that. In fact, if you ate from this tree, you'd actually be like God. You'd be more like God than you are right now. And don't you want that? And of course, the sad, sad irony is that in that moment, before they looked and were tempted and tasted of that fruit, they were already as much like God as they could ever hope to be. But Satan tempts them to step beyond, to go outside the will of God for their lives, and to exert independence and break away from God. Which, when you think about that, you know, that logical train of thought, if God is the source of all life, if we derive our own life by our connection to him, what could be the only inevitable consequence of breaking that bond, of breaking ourselves away from the one who is the source and the giver of all life, and saying, we want to go and be independent from you and cut you out of the picture. And he's the source of life. Of course it's death. Of course it's death. It's not even about, the justice of God has a role to play, but that's not even like the main thing. It's you've unplugged yourself. It's like when if you unplug your toaster from the electrical socket, it immediately is dead because it's unplugged. And that's what God has told them to do. But the enemy, the serpent, convinces them it's the best thing they could do. Their life will be even better to be disconnected from God. And so, obviously, sadly, they agree to it. The man and the woman both together, they eat the fruit, and God comes in and he just destroys them all. No. That's what you would think would happen, right? I mean, like that would be like, you'd think from like at this point, all of humanity consists of two people. They had one thing that they shouldn't do, and they did it, and they totally just, it seemingly have ruined not only their lives, but now the rest of the human race that will come from them, just like has just been totally derailed. Their destiny, the blessing, everything that God gave them, just totally just thrown away in an instant. And you think the easy thing to do, the logical thing to do would be for God to come in and just squish them. Let's start over, get another two people going, and hopefully they'll do better. Iteration, number two. And that's not at all what God does. God comes into the garden. Humans are, part of the fallout of this choice that they've made is they immediately go from being primarily God conscious and other conscious to being self-conscious. They realize for the first time they're naked because they'd never really thought about themselves in that way before. They realize they're naked, they have fear, they have shame. They're obviously guilty and in hiding, and God comes in, and the first thing he does is he curses the serpent. He immediately, he's not fooled or distracted by all the blame game that's going on between the snake and the woman and the man, all pointing fingers at each other and back to God and all of that. Like, not even, he just goes straight to it's the serpent who is ultimately the instigator of all of this. And God curses the serpent. So this is when we have the second poem in the Bible. And this one's quite a bit longer than 127. And God curses in chapter 3 of Genesis, verse 14. And he says, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and above all beasts of the field. On your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. And so when we think about, we imagine, a snake, like an actual, reptile snake, moving, on its belly on the ground, and its just face is in the dirt, is in the dust. God's saying that action of how all snakes in the world, move about and live and function is now a symbolic picture of the enemy who is at work, who instigated all this in Genesis chapter 3. It's symbolic of his forthcoming defeat. He's like, your face is going to be on this animal's face is going to be on the dust as a symbol and as a picture that you are already in defeat. You've already bitten the dust, so to speak. Like, you're done. How is God going to do that? It says in verse 15, this is super, super important verse. God says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. So in some translations, it'll say between your seed and her seed. And then in the original Hebrew, the word there is seed, and it's, someone's seed or person's seed is their descendants or their offspring. But it's also a super significant metaphor and symbol too, the idea of seed. And pay attention to that when you're reading through the Bible and you see the word seed brought up. Like it's supposed to trigger these thinking. It's supposed to take you back to Genesis 1 and the seeds there that were being scattered, and now this seed that comes from the humans. And so what is it talking about there? When you think about the seed or the offspring of the women, that's obvious, like all the people that are going to be born from this female human. But what is it talking about when it talks about the offspring of the serpent? And because what do snakes make as offspring? They make baby snakes, they lay eggs. So that's not what this is talking about. This isn't like the biblical explanation for why humans don't like snakes. There's something way deeper and more significant being stated here, which will be unpacked and explained in the next chapter. That is not just talking about baby humans and baby snakes aren't going to like each other. But it's saying that there are going to be offspring of the serpent. They're going to be serpent-like. There are going to be people that behave like the serpent behaved. Their function, what they do, is snake-like. And they are going to be totally at odds and opposed to people that are behaving human-like. And when I say human-like, I'm saying by the definition of what God has said, this is what humans are supposed to be like in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. To be these image-bearing creatures that are representing and are representative of God on creation. There's now going to be hostility there between those two groups. Okay, so then what? And then it says he. So the seed moves from being all of the humans coming from the woman to now being a particular he, a particular seed. Who is a he? He shall bruise your head. Really easy to miss this, but super significant. Wait, so there's going to be all this line, these two lines, there's going to be fighting, and at some point there's going to be one particular human that's going to come, and he's going to strike not the descendants, not the children of the enemy, but the enemy himself. He's going straight for the root. And when you think about that, it says in my ESV, bruise your head. The Hebrew word chuf means like to strike. And so if you're just imagining what that would look like, so snake on the ground, you're using the pictures that the Bible's given us, you got a human. How does a human, strike a snake on the ground? He stomps on it. And it says strike your head. So he's going to step on or crush the head of this snake. And in doing that, it says, and you shall bruise his heel. So in the very act, this particular human, unique human, is going to come along who is going to crush the serpent. Not the descendants of the serpent, but the one who just deceived and pulled in humanity into this path of sin and death and curse. He's going to crush it, but in the act of that, at the same time, he's going to be struck by that snake in his heel. This is page 3 of the Bible, and already we have a picture of a savior, of a champion who's going to come and make war on the enemy, on the one who introduced sin and death into the world, and ultimately be victorious, but in the act of victory, in the act of defeating death, will himself die. This is, again, on page 3 of the Bible. So when Jesus said, this whole book is about him and is pointing to the necessity and the inevitability of his coming, his death, his resurrection and exaltation, he's not joking. When Paul says that this whole book is able to make us wise about salvation through faith in Christ, Paul knows what he's talking about. It's all right here. And so, from this, immediately then, there are consequences for the man and the woman, right? The areas that they had been given blessing by God now become incredibly difficult and hard for them. The ground that would have just just given up its fruit, and all of this to the man is not going to be hard, and it's going to be thistles and thorns and all of that. And he's going to get his bread, but it's going to be through the sweat of his brow. And the woman can't even imagine. Sure, women out there who've had children can't even imagine like what it would have been like to have natural childbirth and have no pain and all of that. Now there's going to be pain. Like she's going to still fulfill her purpose in bringing life. And the name that Adam, and it's interesting that it's after the fall that Adam takes authority by naming his wife. What was her name before? Did she even need her own name, or were the two so one flesh that one name was good enough for both of them? But now, after the fall, and now that their relationship has really been damaged, he takes authority, he gives her a name, and he gives the name Life, because it's from her now all this life is going to come. And that's still a blessing, but it's going to be a blessing that comes through pain and tears. Just like Adam's blessing to be able to bring life out of the earth is going to come through pain and tears and sweat. And this is all fallout from their decision, but God's not done with this story yet, and he's already promised that there's a better ending coming. We've spent a lot of time talking about the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and if you are listening to this and watching this and thinking like, is this the pace that we're going to go through the whole Torah? Did I just sign up for a 20-year class on the books of Moses? And no, we're going to go a lot faster through a lot of these passages and stories moving out here. But it's super important if you're going to spend a long time on part of a story. One of the best parts to spend a lot of time and read and reread and reread and reread is on the beginning. Because if you misunderstand the beginning of the story, you're gonna misunderstand things that are happening in the middle, and you could easily misunderstand the ending if you don't get the beginning right. And so what we have at the beginning is a very, very good, 7 times good, ideal world that God has made, and that he's placed his own personal representatives and representations of himself into, called humans. And the goal, the point of all this was that humans, as image bearers, unique creatures in the earth, were going to fill the world and reign and rule over it in loving submission to the wisdom of God. And that was the trajectory of the world. The enemy, the serpent, enters in through deception and trickery, tempts and leads the humans into sin, into basically rebellion is really what it is. Rebellion against God and against the author of life. And so they bring death on themselves. They bring, it breaks the relationship between man and God. And even the man and the woman, their relationship is clearly no longer what it was. And now what? Now what's going to happen? And there's this promise that's made at the end of Genesis 3 that there's basically a war that's been started, a war between the descendants of the snake and the descendants of the woman that is going to end up with a savior character that's going to come up in the story at some point and is going to defeat the enemy, the serpent, and in the midst of that himself will die. And then it goes on to, and then, the man and the woman went off and they started having kids, because the blessing that God gave for them to be fruitful and to multiply was not taken away. Like we're gonna see, they're gonna do a lot of multiplying. There's gonna be a lot of begetting and all these lineages that, can sometimes confuse, modern readers, like, why is this stuff important? Why is this in the Bible? But part of it is the author is showing us, look, we're doing what we were made to do. We are multiplying. We are filling the earth. But the question now is, what are we filling the earth with? If our relationship with our Creator, with God, is now damaged, is now broken, if in a sense now we have been cut off from Him, what kind of representatives of Him are we? And who exactly are these descendants of, or offspring or seed of the serpent that was talked about in Genesis 3? Well, as the first couple becomes the first family and we have these two brothers, and there's a lot going on with Cain and Abel, as far as, there's significance to the fact that Abel is taking care of the animals and that Cain is working the land. Because again, none of these stories are in isolation. We're supposed to think about them based on what's just happened in the story, and then even like what comes after. Like you're supposed to go back and reread and think about, oh, that makes more sense now, why that was a significant detail. All the details are important. So for example, the fact that Cain seems the one who's really frustrated. He's frustrated with how God's interacting with his brother versus how he's interacting with him. And what is Cain's primary identity? Well, he's working the land and trying to bring fruit from the land. But what has God just said in the previous chapter about the land and about that process of trying to bring the fruit out of the land? He said it's now cursed. It's going to be frustrating. It's going to be hard. And so Cain is literally, his vocation and his identity is wrapped up now in the curse and in trying to work through the curse. Whereas what Abel is doing in taking care of these animals, these flocks, is connected to the blessing that God gave as far as reigning over the animals and subduing them, and not subduing them in a gonna beat the sheep to death kind of a way, but in a loving stewardship of the animals. So Abel is operating in the blessing, Cain is operating on the curse. There's a lot more even deeper significance and stuff that we go into, but I'm trying to have just the surface level stuff here that's created for tension between them and frustration between them. And Cain's getting really filled up with jealousy against his brother and getting angry. And God steps into the story and has a conversation with Cain about it. And one of the things he says to Cain about his attitude and about his anger and all of that, he says in verse 6 of chapter 4, "Why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it." It's not coincidental. So here we have sin, and this is metaphorical language, right? Because the idea that sin is crouching at the door or coiled up at the door. It's that same picture that we just saw in the previous chapter with the man and the woman at the tree. There was the serpent crouching there at the tree, ready to seduce and to draw in the woman and the man into rebellion against God and against life. And so now we have sin personified in this picture, in this statement by God to Cain, that sin is like that. Like you're at a decision point, just like your parents were, where you're gonna have to choose, are you gonna give in to the serpent, though, through sin, and choose death? Only in his case, he's gonna choose to give death to his brother, or are you gonna choose life? Not just for yourself, but for your brother. And this idea of connecting and relating the concepts of Satan and sin and death like this is a common theme in the Hebrew Bible. And it's one of the reasons why maybe if you've ever read Romans, and if you're following along with Paul's train of thought, and he'll often switch from talking about sin as just kind of a general concept of human sins to talking about sin as if it's a personification of Satan, and then talking about death, and it's all in the same kind of train of thought. These concepts and these ideas are all intermingled together. It's because Paul has spent a lot of time reading over the first few chapters of Genesis and meditating on these things, and because that's the picture that the author is painting here of sin and of death and of the enemy, is that they are all connected and related, and they're how they function, how they work is always the same, to lead us, to tempt us, to ultimately deceive us to our own demise and the demise of those around us. And so what is meant by the seed or the offspring of the serpent seems to be, according to this story, are people who give in, who give over their own free will, their own, they kind of abdicate their own authority and give it over to the enemy to allow themselves to be one more tool to unleash more death and more sin and more curse upon the earth.